Welcome to Encroachment Sports Talk. Since a Supreme Court ruling in 2018 allowed the legalized sports betting has really exploded in the US. Now 36 states have passed laws to allow it to be legal, and another 8 are considering it. So at this point, more than half of Americans live in a state where it's legal to bet on sports. So we wanted to address this in kind of two regards. First is, is this really boom, this huge growth in legalized sports betting good for professional sports teams? And then secondly, is it good for America? So Chris, what are your thoughts on whether it's good for sports teams in America?
Yeah, so I just wanted to add a little more color to some of your statistics, because you said 2018, that was a key date, right? So it's been 5 years. So over that 5-year period, $220 billion has been bet, which is crazy. That's an eye-watering amount of money. And there are 4 major players, which are FanDuel, DraftKings. Those are the daily fantasy sports. That's how they got into it. And then, of course, MGM and Caesars are the other 2. They hold 90% of the market. So it's really...
Not to interrupt, but so to give a little more flavor of that 200 and some odd billion that you mentioned, there was 93 billion of that had been placed in 2022 alone. So that gives you a flavor of the growth.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's just exploding. And actually, the interesting thing is there are 3 states, the largest states, the most populous states in the nation, where they still haven't legalized it yet, which are California, Florida, and Texas. So once it happens in those 3 states, the numbers are going to go up exponentially here. It's crazy. A couple last stats, and then we'll get into the thing. 39 million people bet in the last 12 months, and the average bet is 30 to 35 bucks. So that's interesting. So, but in terms of it's good or bad, I mean, it depends on. It depends on who you are, right? So in terms of, is it good for sports? It's good for the teams themselves, right? It generates more interest, more viewership, more TV revenue through more interest, engagement. It's good for, obviously, the online gaming community and the casinos. I even think it's probably good for the average sports fan if they can moderate their betting habits. Go ahead, Mike.
I think there's some negatives. So as you mentioned, when somebody has a bet on a game, they're definitely more interested. So it drives up television ratings.
Right.
They also, nowadays, bets are so sophisticated, you can do in-game betting. So even during a blowout, you can place a updated bet on the margin at that point, and then, stay interested in the game.
Right.
Networks could also be a lot more sophisticated and be in touch with the amount of dollars that are being bet and decide during blowouts whether or not to switch. And they could actually maximize with technology, they could actually maximize their revenues by deciding which games to switch to based upon how much dollar volume is bet at that time. I can think of a couple bad. I think net in terms of revenue, it is good.
Yeah.
There's 2 things. The obvious is with more gambling, you have risk of corruption.
Right.
But I think, and that corruption generally comes from players or coaches or referees getting in trouble and getting in debt. And I think that's more in the past, where you would be kind of in debt to a bookie who then owned you.
Right, exactly.
I think with legalized sports betting, there's no such thing. Like, if you don't have the money, if you can't borrow, to place the bet online, it probably limits the corruption that way. I'm not sure if there are some angles for corruption. There probably are, but
yeah. Well, there always is. I mean, as you know, the other good one, I've got a bunch of bad ones too, but the other good one that we didn't talk about was obviously at the governmental level, it actually increases tax revenue too, right? So So I mean, and again, none of these goods necessarily outweighs the bads that you've already kind of mentioned some. I'll talk about some of the others, but that's why it's getting approved, frankly. States are down.
I mean, sticking to the impact on sports, there is one. I think it might. This is just me kind of brainstorming, but I think it might have a negative impact on gate revenue. I think it's going to result in less fan royalty, loyalty, not royalty, less fan loyalty. You know, you have the younger and younger kids get attached to sports gambling. Their interest lies with who wins the game, as opposed to, you know, you're not always going to bet on your favorite team because that's not a wise, you know, it's not the way to maximize profits. So you're going to decide, take a look at all the games going on that night and make bets. And therefore, you know, the game you bet on might not be the game being played in your local market. So you're not going to go out to that game.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I think we have a younger generation of more fickle Instagram following kids who don't even watch the games as much, you know, unless they have a bet maybe, but simply follow highlights on Instagram and whatever is sexy. So that's just something I would be a little concerned about if I were professional teams in terms of gate revenue.
Yeah, well, you know, that's a really good kind of unintended consequence of all that. And I really think that's really kind of good analysis. And I hadn't thought of that, but I think it's absolutely true. The interesting thing when I was reading about this topic is the target market right now for gaming is exactly those people, the 18 to 24-year-olds. They have the least wisdom and experience in sports gambling, and they tend to not have like the, you know, control over they can't moderate their gambling.
Their brains aren't developed.
Yeah, and they're not fully developed, right? So that's bad. I mean, I don't think that's a positive thing. And that's the target market that these a lot of these firms and betting operations are going after.
Let me ask you something. From what I understand, most states have a 21-year-old age limit, yet ESPN just did a study on sports gambling in college and found that, you know, like a huge percentage, like I think 58% of the kids had gambled. They did consider fantasy sports as gambling, but they also mentioned that like 19% of the students had engaged in risky gambling, sports gambling activities, which included like gambling more than 3 times a week or betting more than $100 on a game, that kind of thing. How are young kids getting around these laws? Do you know?
You know, I don't know, because they're real strict on the state. I mean, I know that part, I mean, because I've tried it just to see if it works or not, and it doesn't. I mean, they're pretty, because they can obviously geolocate you based on your phone or the device you're
Yeah.
So they can control that part, the geography. But I'm not sure. You're right. I'm not sure how they're getting around the 21. But they are betting. I guarantee you, people under 21 are betting, and I don't know how they're getting around that.
Well, you know what I think is the scariest. It's the same as Facebook and, you know, social media, how they rely on your dopamine, the rush you get from, in the case of social media, it's people liking or viewing your post. But in gambling, you get a natural dopamine high from following a bet that you've made. And what's the most scary is this concept of promo bets. You know, so they can use technology to say, if you've lost 3 in a row and you're like, you know, somebody who's likely to maybe drop off because they've lost 3 bets in a row, or their account has dropped down to 0, they can offer you a free bet and say, hey, you know, risk-free, $200 to make a bet, only catches if you win, you can't take the money out, you have to keep betting. But so imagine if you had a heroin addiction, and anytime you quit for a week, somebody just knocked on your door and gave you a free bag of heroin, you know, I mean.
Well, unfortunately, Mark, I think that may be happening in some parts of our country too these days, or something like it. But you're absolutely right. I mean, it is essentially reinforcing bad behavior, bad decisions, and not allowing people to figure out and develop moderation in these areas. And you got to be, I mean, it takes a lot of time and research and experience to get to a point where even now I'm comfortable, and I just play fantasy stuff mostly, where I'm comfortable making that bet. And I couldn't imagine me 30 years ago, 40 years ago, being in a position to make that kind of decision.
Yeah, there are particular challenges, and you can even see this in the law, but there are particular challenges when it comes to sports betting in that people feel that they are more in control of that than more of a game of chance. They feel because they know the players or whatever that it's a game of skill more than chance. And like, you know, that's why you've been able to bet on daily fantasy for years, because going back to I think 2006 or something, or 2004, there was legalization that prevented online gambling, except for fantasy sports, which was considered a game of skill. And I think, frankly, that got convoluted between, they weren't thinking about daily fantasy, which, I mean, any gambling, if you're a complete novice, you're going to be less, the odds are going to be less in your favor than if you're an expert at it. Like, you know, if you understand the game of blackjack and all the odds, you'll know when to double down and to split and stuff. And if you don't, you know, so there is skill involved in gambling. Same with daily fantasy sports. I mean, I know you can maximize your odds, but it's still a game of chance. You can just.
Oh yeah. No, I mean, there's, and you're right. So that's how they got around that thing, was the game of skill versus the game of chance. And they decided that daily fantasy was a game of skill. And I would contend that that's not entirely the case. Like you're saying, I think there's still a lot of luck to be had. But you can mitigate your risk a little bit better than if you're just betting on winners and so forth.
Yeah, that is, you know, one of the particular challenges. Again, people, when they get into sports gambling, they feel that they can control it. The other thing that's a challenge with, frankly, you know, there is a growing gambling problem in this country. If you look at like the calls to the national gambling hotline, you know, for people who are admitting problems with it, it rose like 84% the calls in 2021 over the prior year.
That's crazy.
So the other thing about gambling addiction versus, say, you know, a drug addiction is it really takes years for somebody to seek help. Because again, they think they're under control. Family can't see the problem. You know, you're not sitting at the dinner table strung out. You may be a little distracted looking at your phone, watching a game or whatever. But and what I read is that, yeah, like I said, people don't seek help for 5-10 years after they start to have a problem.
They can get in a really, really bad hole. And I actually have some, you know, family members that have, you know, distant family members that have gotten some bad holes in that regard. So it can happen. That's why, again, you got to have some limit. It's like anything else. You got to have some limits, right? And but here's the deal. The world has become almost all about gambling. You can gamble on crypto. You can gamble, I mean, with Robinhood. I mean, you can gamble on stocks these days, basically, because you're not doing any research, a lot of these people. So, I mean, the bottom line is you're gonna be exposed because of the technology. You're gonna be exposed to opportunities to screw up just about everywhere. So
that is true. It's always interesting, you know, in the case of a victimless crime, to think through what, if anything, the government should do, right? You know, what's the harm with drugs? I guess, you know, like drugs tend to be more of a victimless crime. Same with gambling, where you're really just hurting yourself. Obviously, drugs can cause other issues where you get into trouble and start robbing and stuff, but same with gambling. So it's always interesting to know what the government can do. But another statistic, so right now in America, substance addiction is 7 times more prevalent than gambling addiction, but the average state spends 338 times on funding for programs to help with substance abuse than they do for gambling abuse. So, you know,
and when I was doing my research, that was all the kind of people on the other side of the, you know, of this story, which doesn't have a right answer one way or another. It's like everything else. There's a lot of shades of gray, but they were saying the exact same thing, Mark, which is it doesn't have any funding. Even the industry should be forced to provide some funding for gambling addiction mitigation, for recovery, whatever the case is, but it's just not out there right now. So
the other thing I saw, I didn't realize Australia is actually way more into gambling than America is. They average twice as much per capita in terms of gambling than America. So they're a little bit further ahead of the game. In Australia, casinos and such are integral and built inside of big cities and big metropolitan areas, where in the US they tend to be on Native American land and stuff where you might have to drive an hour to go. So they're a little bit further down the curve in terms of experiencing problems, and they've toyed with things like mandatory annual deposit limits, gambling limits. There should be something like that, but I don't know what the answer is. But again, this is somewhat of a victimless crime, but it is going to become a bit of a pandemic with younger people getting into problems. And we've seen that, some studies have showed that as many as 19% of problem gamblers have attempted suicide.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's terrible. Yeah.
Yeah, when you have a young, undeveloped mind, first of all, you don't have the control of you probably don't even understand your budget and your finances as well as a grown up, or more mature grown up. But you also, even if you did understand your finances, you don't have the control, and then you get into trouble, and then you have these issues, and you don't see any way out as much as if your brain were more developed. So, it's really interesting that. It always comes down to, give more freedom to people, and then if it's something where they can get in trouble, then you have to come and
you have to find some ways to. But at the end of the day, kind of my thought on the world, which is I'm pretty much a libertarian. And I think you should give people as much freedom as possible. A lot of people can't handle that and can't be responsible with freedom. So you have to put in some guardrails, right? Yeah. And that's a hard thing. How much of a guardrail? How much? Yeah. The other part I think we didn't talk about, and this is interesting, and this is another one of these I would call bad consequences, and we've seen some case studies here recently where you have professional and college players and coaches actually, because it's now online, so available, and they can't monitor it as much. Like if it was just done in Vegas or Atlantic City, or that used to be the way you had to bet, right, or with a bookie, but now it's online. And you can use friends to do it. You can use fronts, right? You can use different methods to get around it. So we've had, and these are young, remember, college players are, again, young minds, right? They're not fully developed. And then some of these pros are pretty darn young too, and they might make some bad decisions. But we've had some recent things like, the coach for Alabama's baseball team was just fired for betting. You had Calvin Ridley, who was just, suspended for a whole year. And then, as you know, Jameson Winston from the Lions was suspended for 6 games. So, so it's creeping into the actual fabric of the professional college sports, realms. And that is a little bit scary because it's—
Why is it scary?
It's scary because, it's obviously jeopardizing the opportunities for these individuals. But also, if they're betting, there could be consequences. They could have either inside knowledge, or if they're playing a game, would be the absolute worst. I don't know how you enforce it, is what I'm getting at. I don't know how you enforce it.
I gotcha. Yeah. You're banned in the NFL from betting on football, but you're saying you got a little guest over your shoulder.
I know. There's my boy up there.
You're banned on betting on football, but you're saying you could have a relative place to bet for you, or—
Yeah, exactly. I think there's a lot of, unfortunately, not a lot of workarounds with this on, the technology again and online. You could have a lot of fronts and still not be. So I'm not sure how I'm sure the professional sports leagues are very terrified of this and are putting in ways to detect this.
Yeah. I'm sure with technology today, they can track patterns and different things like that. If you have this person who suddenly is placing tons of bets that never was, and then it's related to a player, I bet the forensic is probably easier to track that kind of corruption than when you had to walk into a casino. I don't know, but
yeah, but walking into a casino, remember, that kind of stuff is all on film, all being watched and monitored, right? So So you know, because you're in the tech space, you know that these IP addresses can be traced back, and you can geolocate a lot of stuff these days. And so I'm sure they're working on that, but it certainly has, in my opinion, has the opportunity for more corruption and and a possible integrity of the game impact. So who knows?
So the one thing I wanted to point out, we've been talking about how gambling is dangerous for America, but fantasy, non-daily fantasy, where you enter into a season-long fantasy, that should be completely exempt, is still a totally healthy outlet, because for the most part, the dollar amount you make per hour investing in a fantasy league is like pennies because most people are playing for pride.
Yep. Not doing it for the money.
And that is really good for sports, with the potential issue of fan loyalty. But I just wanted to say for the record that season-long fantasy sports doesn't really draw my scrutiny in terms of something that's
and Mark, that would have nothing to do with the fact that you love to be in season-wide fantasy league, right?
No, but I do, but it's also like I realized, like, I've never tried heroin because I have a feeling it might give you an enjoyable sensation other than having to stick something in your vein, but I would be terrified of getting addicted. But on the same token, I do not do any sports gambling because I know, everybody places a bet with a friend, right? Or you enter into a NCAA tournament pool. If I have even $10 at stake, I get so addicted, like the rush of watching that game is just too much. So I've always stayed away and from any kind of sports gambling because it's just I'm afraid of that addiction. And
you're prudent, and you're probably in the top 10% of people that can see the potential outcomes and don't want to even go down that road. But I agree with you. Fantasy leagues, year-long fantasy leagues, 99.9% of them are harmless. I hear about there are some I'm not involved in any of these, but some whale leagues where there's $10,000 entry fee and whatever else. And so you can make any choice in the world or any issue bad.
Yeah.
And so the bottom line is just find some moderation in any of this stuff. But but it was good talk, and there's lots of, as you mentioned, I thought your thoughts on kind of the fan loyalty issue, the unintended consequences, and that's really interesting. And that's a long-term potential problem for these teams.
Yeah. Anyway, I agree. Very eye-opening. Just doing research for this topic, I learned quite a bit, and hopefully, and I think it will, as we said, it's kind of a delayed issue. I think we'll start to see more and more problems, and I think we'll start to see more and more legislation and funding to help with the addiction that's coming. So
and for the record, just so everyone knows, full disclosure, Mark won our NBA league this year. So.
That's why I'm a proponent. Had I lost, I would throw fantasy, year-long fantasy under the bus.
But believe me, it was, and he spent a lot of time and effort doing it. It absolutely was pennies on the dollar compared to
17 cents. I calculated.
You did calculate it. 17 cents. You probably did calculate it.
Anyway, thank you, Chris.
Yeah, you're welcome. Sounds good.
Another great topic.
All right.